we look to resume our session. And again, we are webcasting. We also have been requested for internet access. So those with computers looking for internet access, it's a Valhalla conference, conference 2015, and the password is Valhalla N2, capital V and capital I on Valhalla, and capital I on in. All the rest are lowercase. Number two.
Which one is it?
Valhalla Conference Conf 2015, CONF 2015. Okay.
Okay, so if, can just ask that we put slide 19 up again. So we just, before we close off the education and training topic, and I know we have covered a lot of points on these questions already, but just wanted to put the questions in front of everyone. So thoughts on the Ministry's proposal to terms of entry into a police service, so that's the educational requirements. Skills and training that you feel are important for police services to help them provide effective policing to your community, and whether you have thoughts on cultural competency training for police and what that should look like. So again, have covered a lot of this ground already, but if you have anything to add, now's your opportunity before we move on. Okay, so let's go to slide 20, and we'll move into the accountability to the public pillar. So to give sort of the context around this, every municipality in Ontario that maintains its own police service or is policed by the Ontario Provincial Police under contract is required to have a police services board. These boards ensure that police services operate without inappropriate political interference and sort of prescribe a framework under which the service would operate. And we'll talk a little bit more about the defined roles and responsibilities of police services boards. And we know that many First Nation partners have called for stronger oversight and accountability, for example, linked to concerns regarding use of force and systemic racism, recognizing that's an issue that's been raised in Thunder Bay as well, so something that we're definitely considering as part of our approach to accountability. And sort of one piece around that we'll really focus on is looking to increase First Nations representation on police services boards in municipalities, Ontario Provincial Police, etc., and ways that we can sort of increase that representation as well as consultation and feedback coming into those boards from First Nation peoples and communities. So that'll be a key piece as well. As some of you may know, there was an independent review of the 3 police oversight bodies in Ontario, the SAU, the OIPRD, and the OCPC, and that report was just released on April 6th, 2017. So we're currently doing our analysis around those recommendations, have just received the report and just starting to do that analysis. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well as we go on, but really looking at some of those key recommendations and how they align with this accountability work. So the key initiatives under accountability to the public are really looking at civilian police governance, so focusing on the role of police services boards, that diversity piece as well. Outcomes-based performance measurement, which I briefly mentioned earlier as well. So what outcomes are we looking from police services, and really moving to those more holistic community safety and well-being focused outcomes. And then finally around oversight, linked to the work that Justice Tulloch has done for the independent police bodies review. So if we go to slide 21, for civilian police governance, really it plays a vital role in supporting public trust in police services, in their officers, and in the services that they provide. And civilian police governance and police services boards are really about translating the community-defined needs and translating that into the priorities and the policies for the police service. So some of the key responsibility for boards are really around making sure that effective police services are provided in their communities, determining the objectives and priorities for police services in the municipality or in the First Nation, if it's a First Nation board, establishing policies with respect to police services, with respect to the work that the police services do, hiring the chief of police or selecting the detachment commander, monitoring their performance, and reviewing their administration of the complaint system. So those are sort of the key roles that the police services board plays. if we go to slide 22, just giving an idea of some of what we've heard around the key issues that are impacting the effectiveness of boards and civilian police governance in Ontario. So the first is really around a lack of clarity on the roles and responsibilities of police services boards, and we'll talk a little bit more about clarifying the roles of the board versus the roles of the chief in the police service. And this has sort of been a point where there's some confusion. Need for relevant, consistent, and mandated board training. So one piece we're going to talk about today is diversity, equity, and cultural competency training as it plays into the police service board context and mandating that as well. Ensuring board members have the skills and competencies to carry out their role, so tied to what I had mentioned around the cultural competency piece, as well as just looking at sort of a competency matrix for what we need to see on boards and those key roles that they need to play and how they can do that effectively. And then finally looking at board size and composition to make sure that they address local needs, and again looking at that diversity piece as part of the composition of the board and the size. So if we go to slide 23, looking at the consistency of civilian governance in Ontario. So this is really focusing on the Ontario Provincial Police context. And so right now, the minister's roles and responsibilities related to sort of governing the OPP lack a lot of clarity. There's really not a lot of clear legislative guidance for the minister right now on what powers the minister can exercise with respect to governing the OPP. And so this sort of enables the OPP to largely develop policy for itself without really strong civilian oversight or ministerial oversight in that sense. And also, there's really no mechanism right now for civilian input into governance of the OPP at the provincial level as well as looking at the local level. So at the local level, we know that there's not meaningful participation by all Ontario municipalities, which sort of limits local input into policing priorities and service delivery when the OPP is delivering those services. So what we're looking at is strengthening OPP civilian governance at both the provincial and the local levels. And this would be responsive to some recommendations that have come out of the IPERWASH inquiry that you may be familiar with respect to strengthening OPP governance and providing more of those mechanisms for civilian input. So at the provincial level, we would be looking at clarifying those powers and duties of the minister to make sure that they are as comparable to municipal boards as possible. So actually expanding the powers that the minister has, for example, to establish policies related to the delivery of policing by OPP and monitor the commissioner's administration of the OPP's complaint system. So really expanding those powers to have more input. And then exploring whether perhaps having a provincial civilian advisory committee could help support the minister's decision-making when they're exercising that governance role, and also to increase transparency and opportunities for community input. So this is really at just at the exploratory stages right now, but looking at whether that kind of civilian advisory body would provide that opportunity for community input and potentially also First Nation input as well. And then locally, looking at establishing one police services board per OPP detachment. And this is to make sure that sort of all partners have a voice in a local OPP governance, but also looking at where there may be unique geographic circumstances. So for example, where there's a lot of communities, municipalities in one detachment, then there can be a bit more flexibility around maybe having more than one board in that area to make sure that everybody does have a voice. So that's really the proposals around OPP governance. If we go to slide 24, looking at clarifying roles and responsibilities when it comes to police services boards and governance. So in terms of the roles and responsibilities of both municipal and OPP police services boards, boards are responsible for developing business plans. We're going to sort of reframe this as a strategic plan, which is really more looking at the strategic sort of priorities of the police service and how they should be carrying out their duties. And so in developing that strategic plan, we would require the board to, and this gets at that diversity piece that we mentioned, to consider the needs of diverse populations and communities when they're setting objectives and priorities, to actually consult with diverse communities and populations when developing the plans and setting these priorities. So we could go so far down the path to specify that they have to maybe consult with First Nation communities in developing those strategic plans. and then report on those consultations and how diverse community needs and perspectives have been reflected in board objectives, priorities, and policies. And the benefit of this is it really provides more of that community input into policing, and then the ministry has the power to then inspect the boards and make sure that they're doing this in the strategic plan, and they can take action if this is not being done. Looking at distinguishing the board's governance role from the chief of police's management role. So really, this is around some confusion, as I mentioned, about how the board can get involved in sort of the policing operations or setting the priorities. So it's really providing more guidance for the board and really expanding the ability for the board to provide guidance and direction to the police service on how they should be prioritizing and the policies that they should have in place. So strengthening that role. Making sure that the OPP boards are as consistent as possible with municipal police services boards. So having sort of these equivalent requirements around developing the strategic plan, consulting with the community, making sure that that's as consistent as possible. Increasing public access to board meetings. So clarifying under what circumstances a board meeting can be closed to the public. So right now there's not a lot of clarity. So boards can hold meetings sort of in camera and not include the public. And so we'd be looking to clearly define, like, only in certain situations where it's very sensitive HR matters, for example, can the board hold that meeting closed to the public. Otherwise it needs to be publicly posted, and people need to know that the board meeting is happening and they need to be able to access it. And to support that, also establishing parameters for committees of boards or subcommittees, and including the option for perhaps non-board members to participate on those committees. So that can be another avenue for community input as well, and another way to ensure diversity in sort of the perspectives that are reflected in police service boards, particularly the youth perspective, I think, because you can have perhaps youth sitting on those committees and advising the board members on the local issues. And then finally, clarifying information sharing between the board and council and between the board and the chief of police. So sort of requiring protocols in place, clarifying what information is shared and how. So then going to slide 25, looking at capacity and board composition. So focusing on training, which right now we know the training requirements there's really not much there for police services boards. So right now there's just a current requirement to complete training. There's no sort of specific time frame in which that training has to be completed. So one really important piece for this is a requirement for police service board members to complete mandatory training on diversity and equity, human rights, anti-racism, and cultural competency. And this is to reduce risk of bias, to foster board diversity and inclusion, and also make sure, to the point that was made earlier about training, that everybody is aware of that shared history and everybody is culturally competent who's sitting on the board. And that can support the engagement with communities as well, because you know that the people you're engaging with have cultural competence. And the key piece here is that if the board member doesn't complete that training, then they can't sit on the board. So it would be a requirement that has to be completed within a prescribed or specified time frame, otherwise you're not able to sit on the board. To look at board size, composition, and misconduct, we're looking at the current population threshold. So right now, board size is based on population. So the minimum size is 3 and the maximum size is 7. So looking at maybe increasing that minimum size to 5 and that maximum size to maybe 9 to provide more of an ability for flexibility to have more members on the board. Well, which again can support that diversity piece, because you're having greater avenues now to have community representatives on the board and have their voices heard. Modernizing the code of conduct for board members and enhancing ability to address misconduct, really focusing around if there's conflicts of interest on the board, strengthening the remedies available for that, and looking at modernizing how the code of conduct applies for board members. And part of that as well would be requiring board members to discharge their duties in a way that is respectful of the diverse communities that they serve. So if a board member is, perhaps an instance of racism or things like that, can sort of strengthen the remedies available in connection with that. And then enhancing board effectiveness by assisting boards to address competencies and skills. So providing policy guidance tools and mechanisms to support that. So for example, we could provide a competency matrix that the boards would need to meet or should look to meet, and then sort of a self-assessment tool to see if the board is meeting those competencies, and then the ministry could have the ability to sort of inspect against that self-assessment and see whether the board is meeting those competencies overall. So really enhancing the capacity of boards to carry out their roles, again, their professionalism, their cultural competence, their skills, through all of these sort of different avenues. So then on slide 26, continuing on sort of the capacity and composition piece, we're really looking at board composition in terms of those who are prohibited from being on the board for certain reasons. So right now, current police officers are obviously prohibited from sitting on a police services board for conflict of interest, as well as justices of the peace, judges. So looking at expanding that list to any person who practices criminal law, because, for example, prosecutors may have relationships with police that would impact their impartiality if they're going to be sitting on a police services board. A former member of a police service or a former police officer could be barred from sitting on a board that they were a member of. That their police service was governed by. So, for example, if you're in Thunder Bay and you're a former police officer, you wouldn't be able to sit on the Thunder Bay Police Services Board. However, in another community, a former police officer could sit on that board after a 2-year sort of cooling off or waiting period. And the idea of this is to eliminate potential conflict of interest, bias. If a former officer, for example, has connections with other officers in their service, then it may not be appropriate for them to be sitting on the board of that service. But it may be appropriate for them to sit on another board because they may have a lot of valuable skills and expertise that they can bring to the table. So that's really the intent there. Prohibiting current special constables from sitting on a police services board, again, that connection to the policing world, and they could potentially be employed by the police service, which is a conflict of interest. And then looking at and exploring disqualifying candidates that have specific criminal convictions. And this is one that we're really looking for more feedback around and still trying to get more thoughts around. So these would be convictions that are very serious and related to sort of, would really impact the ability for a board member to carry out their duties. So, for example, corruption or fraud, where it wouldn't be appropriate for someone to be a board member if they had that type of conviction. So that's something that we're considering as well there. And then looking at the diversity piece again, there's a couple of pieces there that we're looking at in terms of the diversity of who's appointed to the Police Services Board. So for provincial appointments, really looking at, and we've heard this from other Indigenous partners that we've been talking to as well, Métis, Inuit groups, that there's really not a lot of knowledge about Police Services Board's appointments, and that's a real barrier for getting people from Indigenous communities to participate in the boards. So having a requirement for the minister to develop programs that actually promote provincial appointments to Police Services Boards to diverse and underserved populations, so having specific strategies targeted at First Nation, Métis, Inuit, and youth to try to get that engagement in the appointments so that we're getting candidates that can be sitting on the board. Also looking at reporting on measures at the provincial level to increase diversity in provincial appointments, so holding ourselves to account, having like an annual report in place as well as sort of a report every 4 years with respect to sort of outcomes on how we're achieving diversity on boards. And really the key piece there would be that these reports could be released publicly as well, so communities could see, okay, here's, boards are becoming more diverse, or boards are not becoming more diverse, and we need to be doing more to make sure that they are engaging populations. And at the municipal level, sort of similar requirements there. So looking at municipalities being required to release a plan publicly that includes consulting with communities on how they intend to achieve diversity on police services boards every 4 years. So again, that holding them to account, that diversity is important on these boards, and that they do need to be reaching out to communities, including First Nations, to make sure that they're involved. And also having the board report to the ministry on data related to appointments and how the board is reflecting and considering the diversity of their communities. So, for example, reporting on the training that's taken, as I mentioned earlier, with respect to cultural competency and things like that. So really trying to target that diversity piece from multiple avenues, because we know that a board that actually represents the community that it serves is the most effective type of board. And the communities in Ontario are so diverse, and that representation is very important for us. So if we go to 27, I guess sort of a base question that we sometimes ask, and I mean, some of you are in the policing world, so this wouldn't be relevant for you, but awareness of police services boards and whether people have actually attended board meetings or are aware of when board meetings happen. Thoughts on the ministry's proposals related to governance of the OPP, so that provincial governance level as well as the local governance that we mentioned. Competencies that you believe board members should be required to have, so skills, knowledge, expertise. Suggestions on how to promote and enhance the recruitment process for boards, including the recruitment of First Nation members. And how we can best train board members on diversity and equity, human rights, anti-racism, and cultural competency, which I think goes back to a bit of the discussion we had about the police training as well. So open it up to any thoughts on these questions. Yes.
Thanks for the mic. I like what you said about the municipal board and the OPP maybe having smaller boards per community area. I suggest that First Nation is very similar to what you would have with the OPP and a smaller, more of a model than trying to influence a bigger municipal board on there. So that's one comment. Another comment related to the competencies of the board. I've had some experience with First Nations boards and with the misunderstanding or clarity of what their roles are. And having said all that, then you're going to try to have them have a background investigation done on the members within. I don't know how it's done in the municipal side, but the police service that they're providing direction to probably is the best place to have that done. So if we have intelligence information, maybe CISO has to be involved to approve who can be on board and who can't be, rather than the police leaders having to say, you probably shouldn't be here because we know we can see about you or what you might be doing. That's not actually criminally convictions and all that related stuff. So you might have another atmosphere where they go to be approved to be on the board of the police service they govern, rather than depend on us to tell them what, amongst each other. So they have to hold themselves accountable, but there might be another recruitment way to do that.
Okay, thank you.
The Alex First Nation Police Services. What's the expectation from Ontario for diversity? I would suspect.
Yeah, so that'll be a bit of a different context, and when we move into which is really up next, is the First Nation policing pillar in a couple of slides. We'll talk about the First Nation Police Services boards, which I think will be a little bit different considerations there. This piece is more focusing on big municipalities like Thunder Bay, where there's a big First Nation population, but as we know, there's been issues where there's no representation on the board, and people feel that their voice is not being heard, and that in policing, their priorities need to be reflected, right? So we'll focus a little bit more on that piece when we get to First Nation policing, but thank you.
I'm just a little bit concerned about the sort of structure of boards, because the boards have to service a larger community, and I just don't feel comfortable when we're still reduced to just a participant in a board structure in terms of a colonial settlement. I mean, we have jurisdiction and rights over our citizens who live in towns, and whilst they might be convicted under the Criminal Code of Canada, they still have every right to kind of know the cases and stuff that they go through. So instead of just reducing us to participants, I think the ministry has to have a respect for our jurisdiction and our rights over our citizens in the townships, and have a process in place that engages the leadership within their communities and within the area of which citizens are of which our First Nation citizens are impacted, because they're citizens, they're not Canadians, they're citizens of a First Nation, and that has to start being respected. So I think that the ministry has to, instead of reducing us to a board, a participant, there needs to be that strict process that engages us as a nation and our leadership. So that's just what I think.
I appreciate that, yeah, and I think what we're trying to get across too in the diversity piece is there's two ways of getting at this. It's the actual representation on the board, so promoting those appointments, making sure that First Nation people are aware and can actually sit on the board and have a voice on the board, but also those consultation and engagement requirements. And part of the requirement for the board to consult could be prescribing that they consult with a First Nation leadership, right? And having respect for that structure and having that protocol or sort of communication in place. So I definitely appreciate that. That's a key piece as well, is respecting those structures and making sure that that consultation is open and is as a piece of it.
I'm not talking about consultation with the board. I'm talking about real authoritative power and jurisdiction over the oversight of police. That's just what I'm suggesting, not consulting with the board. That we have that real authority and power and that right to jurisdiction over our citizens in the townships and within the OPP. That's just what I'm suggesting, not consultations.
Okay, thank you. So if we put slide 27 back up, any other thoughts on the questions here? Okay, so I think we can move to slide 28. So, first of all, looking at outcomes-based performance measurement. So really what we want to do is move towards an outcomes-based performance measurement framework for policing. That would be sort of informed by redefined standards for adequate and effective delivery of community safety services. So that goes back to the work that I mentioned that's underway on what police do and defining those core roles, et cetera, would sort of feed into what outcomes we would want to see for policing. So as part of sort of this outcomes and measuring outcomes, what we want to consider is mandating the provision of data by police services boards that would help us to do that analysis of outcomes. So key pieces there could be data about training, as you mentioned, use of force, call response, as well as looking at race-based data. So you may be aware of the Anti-Racism Directorate in the government is doing a lot of work around addressing racism and looking at the collection of race-based data. So we're working very closely with them to see how we can align our proposal there. But recognizing that that can be very important for policy development and for knowing where we need to make changes as well, and measure outcomes related to culturally responsive policing. And looking at, relying on that type of reporting, measuring and reporting on performance and outcomes of service, community safety service delivery, and using that information for risk mitigation and to enhance our own policy development as well. And then looking at oversight, so as mentioned, there was the review of a police oversight in Ontario conducted by Justice Tulloch. So the independent oversight bodies in Ontario are the Ontario Civilian Police Commission, which really deals with the oversight of police services boards and sort of appeals and matters with respect to that. The Office of the Independent Police Review Director, which deals with the public complaints process, and the Special Investigations Unit, which deals with serious, allegations of criminal conduct by police officers like sexual assault, homicide, and things like that. So really that review is linked to a lot of aspects of oversight and initiatives under the strategy. So you may have seen the report, but there's a lot of pieces around oversight, for example, of other types of community safety personnel like special constables and how that fits in, and looking at sort of professionalizing policing. So whether there's sort of a professional college that sets standards for policing. So a lot of really interesting and meaningful recommendations there that the ministry is currently looking at, and we're going to be coming up with some options around that piece. Also reviewing initiatives to enhance oversight. So looking at body-worn cameras, developing sort of a provincial position on body-worn cameras, as well as mandating identification tags for police officers, so making sure that all police officers, as well as potentially other types of personnel like special constables, are wearing identification tags for transparency to the public. So if we go to slide 29, in terms of the sort of outcomes piece, we look forward to indicate that outcomes should the ministry be looking for when evaluating police performance, what type of information from these outcomes should be provided or reported to the public. So if you have any thoughts around those pieces. Okay, so we can always take comments later on, or can provide written comments, because it is sometimes very hard to think on your feet with these types of questions. I know I find that. So we will move on. Oh, yeah.
Just a general question. So with the report from Tulloch, how much of that work do you plan on putting into this week? So just out of the recommendations, I reviewed some of them. So out of the recommendations, are most of them being implemented? I'm not saying they all have to be, but is this, I realized the report came out last week.
Yeah.
Within that, or were you aware of some of the recommendations already?
We're still looking at it. We're working with it. So we're still reviewing the recommendations because it just did come out last week. So as we get further along in the discussions, I know Justice Tulloch is coming back out and doing some discussions as well as probably the ministry. So as that will inform us as well going forward, but certainly that's kind of been what we've been waiting for in terms of the final piece of this.
And that sort of ties into, I'm going to turn it over to John to talk about First Nations policing, and we will sort of discuss a little bit around oversight as part of that as well, so we'll touch on that.